It's nice to see everyone. Now, I think in this series, this is really one of the high points. We all kind of been waiting to hear about Broadway. Hasn't really what this has been about. And when we think about, and when people, I think broadly speaking, think about Jews in 20th century American music, except for maybe Irving Berlin, the first thing that comes to mind is Broadway. It's not a huge exaggeration, as we shall see, to say that Broadway was a Jewish invention, and without Jews, maybe it might not even exist. In fact, I thought to warm us up today, there's a more recent Broadway show called Spamalot. Spamalot is the brainchild of one of the Monty Python troupe, Eric Idle, who basically took an old Monty Python sketch called about spam and King Arthur, and basically turned it into a play about the making of a play, about making of a play. And one of the early songs in this play is one of the characters. It's basically in the play, King Arthur wants to make a Broadway show, but one of his knights, played by David Hyde Pierce, explains to him that if you want to make a Broadway show, you can't do it without Jews. So let's listen to a little bit of one of the songs for that play. You won't succeed on Broadway unless you have some Jews.
You must take this musical to Broadway. Come on, let's go book seats on the web.
Do you know this Broadway?
Yes, sire, we don't stand a chance there.
Why not?
Because Broadway is a very special place, filled with very special people. People who can sing and dance, often at the same time. They are a different people, a multi-talented people, a people who need people, and who are in many ways the luckiest people in the world. Sorry, sire, we don't have a chance.
But why not?
Well, let me put it like this. In any great adventure, if you don't want to lose, victory depends upon the people that you choose. So listen, Arthur, darling, closely to this news. We won't succeed on Broadway if we don't have any Jews. You may have to find your sets, fill the stage with penthouse pets. You may have the loveliest costumes and best shoes. You may dance and you may sing, but I'm sorry, Arthur King, you'll hear no cheers, just lots and lots of boos. You may have butch men by the score, whom the audience adore. You may even have some animals from zoos. Crows and crabs instead, you may have a lemon bread, but I tell you, you are dead. Don't let it.
We can stop there. I just wanted to give you a little taste of that. It's a great song. You should listen to the whole thing. But now that was a more recent play, but what that's really pointing to is, I mean, this is one of those examples where you have a caricature or stereotype, which isn't meant in a negative way. It's actually basically a tribute. It's an homage to the fact that Jews have been not only instrumental, but indispensable in creating Broadway. And that's really what we want to talk about today. But let me make one disclaimer before I start, because first of all, like Ari said, there's no way I'm going to be able to cite every single Broadway show you want to hear or you think is appropriate. There's just too many. The other thing is there is going to be something conspicuously absent today, and that is going to be Broadway's, for which Leonard Bernstein wrote the music. Leonard Bernstein is our topic for next week. He gets his own special session as he deserves. And so West Side Story, we're not going to talk about West Side Story today or Candide, but that's what we're going to talk about next week. So I just want you to know, because West Side Story is one of the greatest shows, but it's Leonard Bernstein. We're going to talk about that and his other music and his Cottage Symphony, but that's all next week. Just to make sure, I want everyone can relax now if you don't hear West Side Story today, and I don't mention Leonard Bernstein today, next week, okay? But what I do also want to do is I want to start by a little bit of refresher, because we've alluded to the fact, this role of Jews in Broadway before, and really I want to remind us of two things. And with each of these examples, I want to not only say it, but I want to illustrate with a musical example. The first is the fact that the role of Jews in Broadway was part of Jews leaving the old neighborhood of the Lower East Side, which incidentally, I don't know if you're aware, the Lower East Side wasn't called the Lower East Side until it was a Jewish neighborhood. Originally, it was just called the East Side of Lower Manhattan. And then eventually Lower East Side became a kind of code word. That's where all the Jewish immigrants live. In any case, when Jews began to leave the Lower East Side, and eventually they were upwardly mobile enough to move up to other parts of Manhattan, that's one of the things which sort of underlines the road to Broadway, but also because that move wasn't just a physical move for Jews. It wasn't just a change of address. It was also a part of that was also, I would say, a cultural move or the broadening of cultural horizons. Yiddish theater was very much on the Lower East Side. That's where the audience was, the constituency was. But as Jewish songwriters and performers and cultural people began to broaden their own horizons within the city, they began to move up. It's happening as they're becoming more American. And they not only physically move uptown, but also culturally they expand. And that physical and cultural expansion, that's what Broadway is going to be. So let's listen. A song that really illustrates both that physical move out of the old neighborhood, but also that cultural move to a broader world, is a song written by two very important Broadway composers, or a Broadway duo, Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart, who wrote the song "We'll Take Manhattan" for a show called the Garrick Gaieties. So let's listen to a little bit of "We'll Take Manhattan." And what the song's going to mention is all the places Jews that are now going to become part of Jews' world. Sung by Ella Fitzgerald.
Two songs. Summer journeys to Niagara and to other places aggravate all my cares. We'll save our fares. I've a cozy little flat in what is known as Old Manhattan. We'll settle down right here in town. We'll have Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island too. It's lovely going through the zoo. It's very fancy on old Delancey Street, you know. The subway charms us so when Broadway breezes blow to and fro. And tell me what street compares with Mott Street in July. Sweet push carts gently gliding by. The great big city's a wondrous toy, just made for a girl and boy. We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy. We'll go to Yonkers, where true love conquers in the wilds, and stop there in Childs. Oh yes. We'll go to Coney and eat bologna on a roll. In Central Park we stroll, where our first kiss we stole, soul to soul. And My Fair Lady is a terrific film, they say. We both may see it close someday. The city's glamour can never spoil the dreams of a boy and girl. I got that line right. We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy.
There you go. So what you hear in the song is is in the early parts of the lyrics, it's the old neighborhood. It's Mott Street, it's Delancey, it's Coney Island, eating bologna. But as the song goes on, the person in the song is imagining further and further uptown, eventually crossing Fifth Avenue and the other parts of town. It's basically this expansive understanding of New York, which wasn't only becoming part of the actual world of New York Jews, but also the cultural part of New York songwriters and New York and people who wrote plays and things like that, moving up. So that's one thing I want to remind us, that Broadway is really created in a nutshell with the people from Yiddish theater becoming more part of American culture, moving uptown and creating something brand new. And we have to emphasize just how brand new this was. Before there was the phenomenon of Broadway, there were two things. There were operas, there were plays, there were band concerts, but the Broadway show combined all of those things. Either there was Shakespeare with no music, or there were operas where there was no talking. The Broadway show was the first, and it took it from Yiddish theater, which were these Yiddish musicals. So that's the first thing I wanted to remind us of. The other thing, though, is something we saw with Irving Berlin and George Gershwin and others, is sometimes the Jewish composers who were writing music for Broadway, as previously, they would take themes from Jewish music. So let me give you another example on top of the examples we've seen, but this one is a little bit of an unusual and maybe surprising example for reasons I will explain. So here's an example where there was a Yiddish song that was called "Was is gewesen in the Stew." What was and is no more, a Yiddish classic. And here, let's listen to it, sung by David Merowitz. Now, when you listen to it, it might remind you of a famous song that was, well, it's from a movie. It might remind you of a tune you might have heard. So let's listen to "Was is gewesen nicht du."
Lass ich dir in euch reden, mein Herz. Zu red ich von Sinnen, zu red ich von Schmerz. Ich leid von der Krankheit, was heißt nicht kein Kreis. Leid noch zu werden, wo noch leben. Was gewesen ist nicht da. Schon weg jeder Schor, jeder Schor. Den ei vergeht in der Reich. Und wir können die bringen mit zurück. Weil was gewesen ist nicht da. Die Kraft und wenn schwarz, die Herbe grau. Mehr lädt sich, mehr macht sich schön. Mit Nacht aber keinem nur sich allein.
You can stop there, Ari.
Weil was gewesen.
So the part that's maybe recognizable, "Was is gewesen is nicht du." That tune was borrowed and put into a song by Cole Porter called "You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To." You'd be so nice to come home to. Now, we've seen that before, but the unusual thing about this is, I don't want, maybe you got the impression that from this that Cole Porter was Jewish. I mean, that would be great, but no, he was not. Not only was Cole Porter not Jewish, he was about as much not Jewish as you get. He's from a WASPy family in Maryland. He moved to New York. And this is a very interesting story that's going to illustrate something very powerful about this use of Jewish melodies. When he first got to New York, he was trying to make it as a songwriter. And believe it or not, he had no success whatsoever. He couldn't get anyone to buy or to play his music. And he got a piece of advice from Ira Gershwin, who said to him, and this is right out of Spamalot, as if he said, if you want your music to sell, you've got to make it sound more Jewish. And that's when Cole Porter began to look for Jewish melodies. And that's how you have Cole Porter using this Yiddish tune and turning it into a classic. And you might wonder, how would someone like Cole Porter find this music? Truth of the matter is, living in New York, this, along with all the other kinds of music, was just all over the place. You didn't have to go very far to find Yiddish, to find people singing Yiddish tunes on the street, or walk into a Yiddish theater or some other Yiddish show. It wasn't hard to find it. In that cauldron of different music, Cole Porter found this song, and he used it. Now, I want to illustrate that is going to be another important component of Broadway. There's one other component as well. There's one other thing, and then we can dive into some Broadway tunes, okay? Because the Jewish performers who were coming out of the Lower East Side, who were becoming part of the New York entertainment scene, it wasn't just about Yiddish theater. It was about, there was a comedic element to it. There was an irreverent element to it. And I think nowhere was this more illustrated by two up and coming, I don't know what to call them, Jewish divas. One was Sophie Tucker, who was a stand-up comedian. That's for another time. But the other one, and really the main one, was Fanny Brice. Fanny Brice was this great performer. She could sing. She was funny. She had a radio show character, a show called Baby Snooks, which was one of my mom's favorite radio shows. Now, I've listened to some of it. It's funny. It's really funny, and it's aged really well. So that element of performing was also woven in to this whole Broadway scene, so much so that, in fact, eventually there would be a Broadway show about Fanny Brice called Funny Girl. And the guy who made that show was celebrating what Fanny Brice was for Broadway. It's a point where Broadway is becoming self-referential a little bit later on. In fact, when the guy who made Funny Girl was looking for someone to play Fanny Brice, his first choice was Ethel Merman. And Ethel Merman had the voice, but Ethel Merman didn't have the, I guess in Yiddish you'd say she didn't have the tom. She didn't have the flavor. So the person who made the show, Julie Stein, was looking for the right person to play Fanny Brice. And who could play Fanny Brice? He happened to be in a nightclub, and there was this young woman singing on stage who had this great voice, but also had this great persona. And he looked at her and said, "That's Fanny Brice." And of course, that was Barbra Streisand, who wound up playing. This was her discovery moment. She wound up playing Fanny Brice on Broadway in Funny Girl. Okay. But let's come back now directly to this whole Broadway scene. Jewish songwriters and Jewish librettists, they began to write these shows, and they began to produce these remarkable shows, usually in tandems. Rodgers and Hart was one, but I suppose the most famous one was Rodgers and Hammerstein. So obviously, we're not going to talk about Jews in Broadway without talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein. Now, Richard Rodgers was very much out of that milieu and out of that world we've talked about so far, much like he was maybe just a generation later, one generation later version of Irving Berlin and the Gershwins, very much that same kind of thing. He grew up in that world. He began to write these terrific songs. Oscar Hammerstein was a little different story. Now, the Hammerstein that wrote with Richard Rodgers was Oscar Hammerstein II. His father, Oscar Hammerstein I, was also a songwriter and also a producer. He was not, they weren't Jewish. They were of Jewish origin. They had actually were part of an upper class Jewish, assimilated Jewish elite, but he still had that connection and flavor of Jewish music, and they began to produce these quintessentially great musicals together. They did it all the way through the 1930s. And the list of what they are able to do, the songs, the words and the music and the shows, and just the explosive elegance and excitement about the shows, it was absolutely remarkable. But I think one of the things they were able to do, and I think one of the things which a singular character of Broadway, beyond the amazing entertainment and the new genre and the combination of music and lyrics and comedy and irreverence and involving the audience and fun and excitement, was a group like a tandem like Rogers and Hammerstein, like other Broadway producers and writers, they took their role seriously. They never had a sense that they were just making something that's supposed to be entertainment. They had a real sense that entertainment, even if it's just a Broadway musical, has the opportunity actually to teach people something. In other words, they believed it was important to use the popularity and the appeal and the reach of these shows. And let's make no mistake, they had real impact. These shows would sell out every night for months. People would not only be packing in to see them, they would come multiple times. They'd buy a ticket and another ticket and another ticket and bring their friends. But they also wanted these shows to have some kind of message. And one of the recurring messages I think that you can find through Broadway shows for decades, I would describe as fighting prejudice, especially keeping in mind Broadway comes of age in the 1930s and the 1940s. And this is a time when people in America, Jews and otherwise, are just alarmed by this surging prejudice and racism and discrimination in America, in Europe, and everywhere. And they wanted to use these shows to say something about it, about the human condition. So let's look at a couple of examples of how these shows, and certainly Rogers and Hammerstein shows, how they could be used to combat discrimination and bigotry. Now, before we do that, I just realized I forgot to play the clip from Cole Porter, "You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To." Let's pause and listen to that. We can't go on. Now, there's two of my favorite recordings of this song. One is sung by Dinah Shore. One is sung by Sarah Vaughan. Now Sarah Vaughan is awesome, and we heard her before. But since we already heard her, let's hear the version of Cole Porter's song sung by Dinah Shore, and then we'll talk about Oklahoma. Yiddish tune.
You'd be so nice to come home to. You'd be so nice by the fire while the breeze on high sang a lullaby. You'd be all that I could desire under stars chilled by the winter, under an August moon burning above. You'd be so nice, you'd be paradise to come home to and love.
I just wanted to make sure you heard. Das was is given, shall you be so nice to come home to. So now let's talk directly about Broadway. Let's talk about Oklahoma here. Now, I'm going to assume that Oklahoma is something familiar to you. Oklahoma it premiered on Broadway in 1943. It was based on a 1931 play called Green Grow the Lilacs. And it's the play was a little bit more serious. The play was about a young girl, Lori, who's courted by a rancher and a farmer. And what the play is really about, and ultimately the musical is going to be about, is this tension and rivalry between cowboys and farmers. And the reason there's this rivalry, you may know the story, is these are two very different versions or two very different understandings of the best way to use the land. Because remember, farmers and cowboys in the way they use the land is fundamentally incompatible. Farmers want to fence it in. Cowboys want to leave it all open. Ranchers want to leave it all open. And ultimately, that's what the play is about. She's courted by Curly, who's the rancher, who's the cowboy, and this kind of creepy character whose name is Jed Fry. And the musical picks up on that. Now, the musical also adds a great celebration of America. Because remember, especially someone like Richard Rodgers, this is a second generation American Jewish immigrant who, like Aaron Copland, he's very much part of American society. He loves America. I mean, a deeply rooted patriotism, a real love of America, and he sees possibility in America. So when the play opens with "Oh, what a beautiful morning," anytime you have a song about the dawn and the beginning of the new day, that's a song about hope and possibility. But the song in the play that really gets to the heart of what the play is about is the song about the farmer, called "The Farmer and the Cowman Should Be Friends." Now, it's done in a lighthearted way, much more lighthearted than the original play. It's done in a very lighthearted way, but what it's pointing out is these inherent tensions between the two, and can they actually get along? Can they learn to be friends? So let's listen to a little bit of "The Farmer and the Cowman Should Be Friends."
The farmer and the cowman should be friends. Oh, the farmer and the cowman should be friends. One man likes to push a plow, the other likes to chase a cow, but that's no reason why they can't be friends. Territory folks should stick together, territory folks should all be pals. Cowboys dance with the farmers' daughters, farmers dance with the ranchers' gals. Territory folks should stick together, territory folks should all be pals. Cowboys dance with the farmers' daughters, farmers dance with the ranchers' gals. No.
I'd like to say a word for the farmers.
Well, say it.
He come out west and made a lot of changes.
He come out west and built a lot of fences.
And build them right across our cattle ranges.
Why don't those dirt scratches go back to Missouri where they belong? That's right.
The farmer is a good and thrifty citizen.
He's thrifty, all right.
No matter what the cowman says or thinks, you seldom see him drinking in a barroom,
Unless somebody else is buying drinks.
But the farmer and the cowman should be friends. Oh, the farmer and the cowman should be friends. The cowman ropes a cow with ease. The farmer steals her butter and cheese. But that's no reason why they can't be friends.
Territory folks should stick together. Territory folks should all be pals. Cowboys dance with the farmer's daughters. Farmers dance with the rancher's cows.
Quiet, everybody.
I'd like to say a word for the cowboy.
Oh, you would you?
The road he treads is difficult and stony. He rides for days on end with just a pony for a friend.
I sure am feeling sorry for the pony.
The farmer should be sociable with the cowboy. If he rides by and asks for food and water, don't treat him like a louse, make him welcome in your house.
but be sure that you lock up your wife and daughter.
Who wants old farm woman anyhow?
Notice you married one so you can get a square meal.
You can't talk that way about ours.
He can say what he wants.
Ain't nobody gonna slug out anything.
That's one of those where it's this happy play and suddenly this happy square dance where everyone's together. They're all trying to be, American settlers on the prairie together, but this tension is lingering and the play really brings it out. And ultimately it really comes to a head where Curly and Jed, the cowman and the farmer, really fight it out. I mean, almost to the death. But that's the serious dark side of this play, which is presented to a Broadway audience with a lighter touch of music. And it's one of the things that Broadway shows were able to do, is to soften these difficult subjects. Now, I think an even more vivid and more overt social message is in the play South Pacific. South Pacific, which first appeared in 1949, was a musical based on a series of short stories by James Michener called Tales of the South Pacific. It's about American soldiers who are in the South Pacific during World War II. A lot of it is about their camaraderie. One of the main characters, he falls in love with a local native, which is okay for some of them, and it's okay for him, but some of them are a little disturbed by that, by the fact that this American guy is actually thinking about becoming involved with someone from the South Pacific. And there's one song where the song called You've Got to Be Taught, where this is basically a song that's parodying that's the way that Americans, like these Americans, have been taught to be inherently suspicious and even hateful of people who are different. So let's listen to You've Got to Be Taught by Rodgers and Hammerstein.
To be taught to hate and fear, you've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Who's out there, Ari? Now, it's no coincidence that both this song from Oklahoma, 1943, and from South Pacific, 1949, are written when they are. Because keeping in mind, this is Richard Rodgers and Hammerstein writing these songs at a time when prejudice, racism, discrimination, obviously surging in Europe, but they're also surging in America as well. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Richard Rodgers is an American Jew, and it was hard to be Jewish during the Second World War without being aware of this rising anti-Semitism. Just give you one example. In 1944, a survey, Americans were surveyed. I can't remember if it was by the New York Times or by some other publication. And in 1944, they were asked, who poses the greatest threat to America? Japan came in second place. Germany came in third. More than 40% of the people surveyed in 1944 in America said Jews. So this wasn't something he was imagining. But the reason he did this is to shine a light on this, to try to diffuse it, to try to teach people to shy away from it. And I'd say as time went on, the more overt, the more explicit this critique of discrimination and prejudice became. So in 1966, we have the play Cabaret. I'm going to skip one clip, Ari, and then we'll go back to the one from Wicked. We have this play Cabaret. Now, Cabaret is set in Germany in the 1920s, in Weimar, Germany. During, well, the Weimar Germany is kind of parallel to the Roaring 20s. There's this big cultural explosion. And in many ways, it's based on a novel by Chris Isherwood about him having to leave Berlin. But it's also loosely based on the life of a German Jew who lived in Weimar, Berlin, a music writer named Kurt Weill, who was forced to flee. And the play Cabaret is really talking about the openness and the wildness and the freedom of this cultural world, but how it's being tamped down by a growing prejudice. And the song that really brings this out is the song called If You Could See Her Through My Eyes from Cabaret. Now, we have to listen all the way to the end. It's a couple minutes, and basically it's the lead character played by Joel Grey. He's basically trying to understand why he's dancing with the woman, he's dancing with his lover, and he doesn't understand why anyone appreciates her. And you have to wait for the punchline all the way until the end. So let's watch If You Could See Her Through My Eyes from Cabaret. No, pitches. Becomes the love of his life.
I know what you're thinking. You wonder why I chose her out of all the ladies in the world. That's just the first impression. What good's the first impression? If you knew her like I do, it would change your point of view. If you could see her through my eyes, you wouldn't wonder at all. If you could see her through my eyes, I guarantee you would fall like I did when we're in public together. I hear society moan, oh sweetheart, but if they could see her through my eyes, maybe they'd leave us alone. Tickle, tickle. Tickle, tickle. Woohoo! How can I speak of her virtues? I don't know where to begin. She's clever, she's smart, she reads music. She doesn't smoke or drink gin like I do. Yet when we're walking together, they sneer if I'm faulting her fan. But if they could see her through my eyes, maybe they'd all understand. I understand your objection. I grant you the problem's not small. But if you could see her through my eyes, she wouldn't look Jewish at all.
The whole song, it's being teed up as something absurd. He loves a gorilla, but it's really what it's teeing up is how absurd it is to dehumanize Jews. And remember, this is a song about a life of German Jews who were forced to flee because they were being dehumanized. They go through the whole song to set up that moment. And audiences, when they would see it for the first time, they would talk about how shocked they were. Well, first they would say, I was so disturbed that he was talking about a gorilla like someone he loved. But then the ending, the punchline makes the whole thing worthwhile. And when people would see it for the second time and knew the setup was coming, this would be an uproariously funny and an ironically funny kind of scene. But that is a very powerful and self-referential statement about what German Jews were dealing with. This is really not only a condemnation of Nazism and anti-Semitism, but discrimination generally. Now, one last example of this, speaking of discrimination, another very blunt one. This is the most recent, I think, or a more recent one, the most recent example, and that's the play Wicked. Now, Wicked is based on a novel which retells the story of the Wizard of Oz through the vantage point of Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West. But and this is sort of a prequel to that story. In this story, Elphaba and Glinda, they wind up being friends in school, but Elphaba is green and Glinda is blonde. They're very different. One of the early songs in the play is called Popular, where Glinda, because she's blonde and she's white, she's just everyone's favorite. And Elphaba, who is green and periodically through the play is referred to as colored, is basically an outcast and on the margins. The other part of the play is that takes place in this world where there are these animals that can talk, but during the course of the play, these animals are losing the power of speech and basically being demoted to just animals. So there's a song early on in the play, because Glinda and Elphaba, when they originally meet, they deeply don't like each other. I mean, they're roommates. They don't like each other. They see each one that's different, but what they're trying to do is overcome this innate disdain that each has for the other because they're different. And this is a song called What Is This Feeling? So let's listen to just a little bit of the song. I'll read you one lyric, and then we'll listen to a little bit of it. One of the lyric is, let's just say, I loathe that every little trait, however small, makes my very flesh begin to crawl. With simple, utter loathing, there's a strange exhilaration in such total detestation. It's so pure and strong. Though I do admit it, come on fast, still I do believe that it can last, and I will be loathing you my whole life long. Two people who just loathe each other because they're different from one another. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
Popsicle. My dear father, there's been some confusion over rooming here at Shiz. But of course, I'll care for Nessa. But of course, I'll rise above it. For I know that's how you'd want me to respond. Yes, there's been some confusion, for you see, my roommate is unusually and exceedingly peculiar and altogether quite impossible to describe. Blonde. What is this feeling so sudden and new? I felt the moment I laid eyes on you. My pulse is rushing, my head is reeling, my face is flushing. What is this feeling? Fervid as a flame. Does it have a name? Loathing, unadulterated loathing for your face, your voice, your clothing. Let's just say I loathe it all. Every little trait, however small, makes my very flesh begin to crawl. The simple utter loathing, there's a strange exhilaration in such total detestation. It's so pure, so strong. Though I do admit it came on fast,
I couldn't find video with the original Broadway cast with Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth, but these two are good as well. Now, I think what's true, and certainly in Oklahoma and South Pacific and in Wicked, less so I think in Cabaret, is they're not just shining a light on it. Each provides a way for resolution. Each provides a way for the two sides that don't like each other, or the points of view, or whatever the source of this discrimination is and the hatred, actually to be resolved. And each one ends, at least that part of it, more upbeat. But I think that is a common theme in many of these Broadway shows. Now, there's one other thing we have to mention, because you're wondering, is he really going to talk about Broadway and not mention Fiddler on the Roof at all? Well, I saved that for last, because I think Fiddler on the Roof is really going to capture this whole Jewishness coming to Broadway. So let me spend the last few minutes talking about Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof, as you know, I mean, as a Broadway show, it debuted in 1964. The Broadway show was based on an earlier Yiddish film from the 1930s. The Yiddish film was based on a series of short stories by Sholem Aleichem called Tevye der Milchiker, Tevye the Milkman. Now, I should say that the original Yiddish movie, and the novels, the short stories, are much, much darker than the Broadway show. In these originals, the main character in these is the daughter Chava, the one who marries the Russian. That's the main story. And the whole image of the Fiddler on the Roof is a very dark image. It's about the precariousness of Jewish life in the shtetl in so many ways. Not only the possibility of persecution, but the possibility of your daughter, if she reads a book, she might be a free thinker and go and marry the Russian. I don't know if you're aware, in the original, Chava goes and marries the Russian. They basically cut her off, but then she wants to come home and the Russian won't let her. So she disappears, and Golda, the mother, dies, literally dies of a broken heart. It's much, much darker. Before she dies, there's a scene, you know how Tevye is always quoting the good book. You know, when Chava goes and marries the Russian, this is both in the Yiddish film and also in the play, you know, when Chava marries the Russian, Tevye starts to quote the good book, you know, as the good book says, and Goldie scolds him and says, maybe if you weren't, I'll paraphrase, maybe if you weren't so busy quoting the good book and you would have been more of a father, maybe this wouldn't have happened. This is about the disillusion of the Jewish family. It's very dark. Now, the Broadway show, not surprisingly, it softened it. It softened it for an American audience. In some ways, it had to. And this is really part of how that Broadway show was made. Because when they first decided to make Fiddler on the Roof, you know, they commissioned the music. Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnack did the music and the lyrics for these songs. But it took a while for them to actually bring it to Broadway, because their basic mindset was, this can't just be something only for Jews. It can't only be about the shtetl, and it can't only be about Jewish life, and it can't only be about the problems Jews had in the old world. It has to be about something bigger, something that everyone, all kinds of people, can appreciate. And they labored with this question, and finally, but the answer to this question, what is it about this story that everyone can appreciate? Well, that I can tell you in one word: tradition. The notion is that Jews aren't the only ones with traditions. Every family has their traditions. And every family, when they came to America, has this tension between that older generation that's trying to preserve the traditions and the younger generation that's trying to break away. And everybody, Jewish or otherwise, has family dynamics and problems between siblings and husband and wife and parents and children. And everyone has those characters in town who are important parts of their community. So really, what drives this play on Broadway, and really what makes its appeal so universal, and let's make no mistake, this play has been performed all over the world to sell out audiences, is this issue of tradition. And that's why tradition is put front and center in the play. So in the song Tradition, yes, there are little elements of it that are specifically Jewish, but the way it's describing the traditional role of the father, the mother, the son, and the daughter, this is true in traditional cultures of all kinds. All kinds. Let's listen to a little bit of Tradition.
Easy now. But here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so dangerous? Well, we stay because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
Tradition, 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 tradition.
Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Anatevka, we have traditions for everything. How to sleep, how to eat, how to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do.
Who day and night must scramble for a living, feed a wife and children, say his daily prayers, and who has the right, as master of the house, to have the final word at home. The Papa, the Papa, tradition, the Papa, the Papa, tradition.
It's not that hard. I know. It breaks my heart to cut that off in the middle, but for the sake of time. Now, two other songs which also illustrate the universal appeal of Fiddler on the Roof. One is If I Were a Rich Man, because many people living in America were only a generation or two, even if when they went to see the play in the 60s, they were middle class, could buy a ticket. They're only a generation or two being removed from being poor and from aspiring to be rich. Now, the song If I Were a Rich Man is based on a short story, which is really a monologue written by Sholem Aleichem called Oib Ich bin Rothschild. This is Tevye saying, if I were Rothschild, you know, and just imagining what it's like to have stuff. And the whole song is about that. And that really was, in many ways, the not only the mind of the Jewish immigrant struggling to make it in America, or just struggling to make a better life for himself and his children, but really that's the struggle of the immigrant that this play, produced by Jews essentially, is able to resonate. Similarly, the marriage ceremony and the marriage scene, because it isn't just a Jewish marriage, it's a whole family and a whole community celebrating the remarkableness of the moment of two young people not only getting married, but they're actually moving the community along toward the next generation. So if I had another 20 minutes, we could look very closely at Fiddler on the Roof. The other thing about Fiddler on the Roof is not just this world of tradition, but what happens when between generations, the world begins to change and the generations are torn apart. And so Tevye, he has two of his daughters literally ripped away from him simply because the world changed, not because they don't love each other, but because the world is changing. And in 1960s America, this is a time when the world, of course, is changing, but it's also a time when Jews in America have experienced great change in a couple of generations, where they themselves see themselves as very different from their ancestors. I'll just end with one little comment. You know, if you ever read Mad Magazine, Mad Magazine had a great spoof of Fiddler on the Roof. This whole thing about generations and traditions being unraveled. In Mad Magazine, you know how they did those spoof musicals? Instead of Fiddler on the Roof, it's called Antenna on the Roof. And it's basically the same story, except told about a suburban Jewish family whose children are all alienated from the parents. But what it's spoofing, what it's really characterizing about Fiddler on the Roof is this universal appeal of the question of tradition. And that's really the whole the part of the magic and the success of Jews on Broadway, is to be able to take ideas that were very near and dear to Jews, that Jews had experienced very specifically, in this case, prejudice and tradition, and put them on the stage in a way to show how these are universal ideas, how these are concerns and aspirations shared by Jews with everyone else. And that's why they made such a splash, and they're such an important part of American culture. Now, next week, we'll go to part B about this, when we see how Leonard Bernstein really took all of this and really brought it to its full fruition. That we'll turn to next week.
Thank you. Just a few quick questions and notes. So the challenge with sharing recordings of Professor Lupovitch's programs is that we have so many clips from movies and shows that YouTube blocks us. So that's why, I don't know if you've noticed, many of our links now are on Vimeo. So if you go to YouTube, you can't find some of these programs, but I share them in follow-up emails, and Shirel's been sharing them as well. So, and often now it's on Vimeo. Number two, one of the earliest shows, I think Mary Kraft and Jeff Coffin brought up that you skipped, was Showboat in 1927, and how it dealt with maybe the first show to deal with racism. So of course you can't get to everything, but I thought I would share that.
Great example.
One question was, is Broadway today as Jewish as it was back then, or is it now more multi-ethnic, or is it still dominated by the Jewish producers and so on? Writers.
I think that's great. First of all, producers, yes, there still is a large Jewish role in bringing Broadway shows, and many actors are Jewish. They're also, it is more diverse, though. And I think one of the things, the way Broadway has changed, because remember, these original great Broadway shows were really put together by second-generation Jewish immigrants who are really confronting American society. Now we have something similar, but Jews are much more settled in America, and they're more removed from that immigrant struggle. So now we have, for example, a second-generation Latino immigrant named Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is telling this universal story of Hamilton from the vantage point of Latinos. But in many ways, the template he's using for Hamilton is the template that Jews who are in a similar position several generations ago were using for these other plays. So yes, many others are producing these plays, and so there are proportionately fewer plays by Jews, but Wicked is very recent. I mean, Wicked is another example of this, but I think the greater diversity reflects the fact that the universal appeal of these basic themes. There are simply more people now who are part of this American musical and cultural scene, and more different styles of music have been incorporated and mainstreamed. For example, making Hamilton 50 years ago would have been unthinkable, because who had ever heard that music? No one would listen to that kind of music. But now everybody loves that music. So that these new sounds, as they get incorporated, more and more people and a more diverse array of people can make these shows.
The last point, of course, this series is about music, and so you focused on the musical aspect of Broadway. But can you say something about the non-musical shows on Broadway, and if they follow the same trajectory that you outlined regarding the music?
So. I mean, I think it's less overt. I think for Jews, they were much more directly involved in the music. I think for Jews, access to Broadway is more musical, although there certainly are non-musical shows that have Jewish themes. They do it as well. I think there are examples. We could have a whole separate lecture of non-musical shows and the way Jews do it. I think one of the most popular shows or plays, I should say, which is presented on Broadway again and again, is The Merchant of Venice. And each time it's presented, the Jewish character of Shylock is reinterpreted. So when Dustin Hoffman played Shylock in the 1990s, his Shylock was very different from the way Shylock was played 100 years before or 50 years before. So there are older shows, but there are also newer shows as well. I think in many ways, it's a separate set of dynamics, because for Jews, the main access into a lot of these shows was the music and songwriting.
Right. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and wishing you all a happy and a healthy, a safe Shabbat and a weekend. We'll see you back on a new set of programs on Sunday, but Professor Lupovitch will be back with us on Tuesdays and Thursdays throughout February. With that, enjoy the rain, the snow, the cold. Is anybody having nice weather? I think someone in Dallas said they're having nice weather. So if you're in Dallas, enjoy your nice weather. The rest of us are bundling up. Take care. See you guys soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Howard. Bye-bye.